A brutal tower of terror lurks above the city as the residents of Caracas go about their days. No outsiders can enter, but rumors of what goes on inside are passed around with hushed voices. Kidnappings, body parts thrown from the roof's helipad, live children falling to their death, and the murderous mob boss who rules with an iron fist. Despite all of this, some speak of the tower in an awestruck way, wishing they could live there, daydreaming about what life would be like inside the world's only self-governing vertical city. In April 2012, the tower was raided by police searching for a kidnapped diplomat. Guillermo Chilela, the trade attaché working for the Costa Rican embassy, was taken, and on the streets, one rumor stood above the rest that the foreign ambassador had been snatched from his car and taken to the tower, held by violent gangs among the unfinished upper floors. Cholela's car that he was taken from had been left abandoned in the middle of a street near his home. The police had identified 2 suspects in 2 criminal groups and moved quickly to organize a raid, storming into the maze-like interior of the Tower of David. Apartment by apartment, they kicked in doors, seizing unregistered weapons and searching for any sign of the missing diplomat. The tension was high between the police and the residents, who wouldn't admit to any accusations. And then, just as quickly as it began, the operation was halted. Orders came down from headquarters. Pull back. Cholele wasn't there. He had been kept blindfolded the whole time, driven around town being moved between safe houses as his captors tried to stay ahead of the police on their trail. But with police pressure closing in and raids underway, the gang panicked, and the abductors ended up dumping Cholele in Chalayeve, a neighboring town. The man was found disoriented from a head injury, wandering a dodgy area in the early hours of the morning, where he was found by a newspaper delivery man. Like a lot of crimes in Venezuela, it's unclear whether there were ties between the 2 criminal groups responsible for the diplomat's abduction and the group who held the tower. The abandoned skyscraper was held by a malandro, a criminal willing to use violence and brutality, controlling who got to live in the building and got to keep their illegal guns. From the outside, nasty rumors about the Tower of David in Caracas, Venezuela, and its inhabitants were common. The abandoned building was seen as an eyesore, a vertical slum, and also the hotbed of criminal activity. The press didn't help the image, painting the tower as a haven for thugs, murderers, and kidnappers, controlled by organized criminals. Stories were told about a prison-style brutality, where dismembered body parts of the offenders were strewn to the ground from the upper floors. Even though the tower was lawless, they were a tight community that was still governed by rules. They were just their own. The residents were led by an ex-convict named Alexander El Niño Daza, previously incarcerated for an illegal gun charge. He was known to the police as he had eradicated and replaced the group of melandros who once terrorized his family in his hometown, and later continued on his gang-related activities in Caracas. But apparently, he had repented his old ways. Reborn in prison, he had now begun practicing as an evangelical pastor, and even built a makeshift sanctuary inside the Tower of David for church service, or so he claimed. Everyone in Caracas had heard something about the Tower of David: mafia retribution, children tumbling into the abyss, stories that blurred fact and fiction. So while it's unsurprising that the tower had a bad reputation, growing darker each year, how true were the rumors? Trying to dig up more information about what happened to the thugs and troublemakers in the early days of the occupation has been difficult to say the least. Residents who were part of the first group to settle in the building have a staunch, don't ask questions attitude. An article published in The New Yorker in January 2013 quotes one of the early pioneers interviewed by journalist John Lee Anderson, and it seems like a really rough start with gang fights. At the beginning, things had been terrible there. The tower had been ruled by melandros, she said, shaking her head. There had been beatings, shootings, killings. Later, Anderson described his experience about the tower. There are sentinels on duty and an electric-gated entrance, guarded by El Niño Daza's people. He described that the ex-con ran the tower like his private fiefdom, and underneath his guise of a clean-cut image holding a Bible, often quoting from it, there was still something sinister. Daza was rumored to have cleaned the tower up, both literally and figuratively. When Anderson asked El Niño himself about the rumors of the prison-style executions, of people being mutilated and their body parts thrown off the upper floors, the leader didn't give a straight answer. Daza made the non-committal pursed lip movement common to Venezuelans. What we want is to be left to live here, he said. We live well here. We don't hear gunfights all the time here. Here there's no thugs with pistols in their hands. What there is here is work. What there is here is good people, hard-working people. When I asked Daza how he had become the tower's jefe, or leader, he pursed his lips again and finally said, "In the beginning, everyone wanted to be the boss, but God got rid of those he wanted to get rid of, and left those he wanted to leave." But what had this gigantic structure been before El Niño Daza seized control of it? The third tallest building in Venezuela, Centro Financiero con Finanzas, was meant to be a booming financial center when construction began in 1990. The architectural plans envisioned a 45-story tower of luxury offices with a glass facade alongside several floors of parking, and even a rooftop heliport crowning the skyscraper. However, in 1994, Venezuela experienced a catastrophic banking crisis, with 18 banks failing in the span of a year and the country's financial sector in jeopardy. Construction of the towers stopped overnight, leaving only a hollow shell of concrete and rebar with scattered panes of glass. The situation of the skyscraper was complicated. Its main inventor, David Brillienberg, which the tower is still dubbed after, had died of cancer the previous year. Fogade, the government's deposit insurance agency, assumed control of the property, along with other seized assets. Officials attempted to auction off the tower in 2001, but legal disputes, a collapsing economy, and the structure's rapid deterioration made it unsellable. Plans to make the building the mayor's headquarters were also quickly abandoned. By the early 2000s, the half-built giant remained stuck in limbo, with its skeletal frame hanging over Caracas like an emaciated behemoth. Meanwhile, the city, with a population of over 3.2 million, was also going through a suffocating housing shortage, and an incoming wave of migration from rural communities didn't help. The government, crippled by economic turmoil, couldn't keep up with the demand for affordable housing, so entire families were crammed in barrios, hillside shantytowns that people built out of whatever they could find, most of the time illegally. But of course, they had little in the form of legal options. In 2000, the barrios made up almost 45% of Caracas, spilling from the periphery of the city into the urban core. And since inhabitants lacked basic city services like electricity and plumbing, it was a hard life. The community had very low income, unsanitary living conditions, violence, and a high crime rate. The ruins of Venezuela's banking crisis were never cleaned up. Towering shells, like the Centro Financiero con Finanzas, along with luxury malls and apartments, stood as haunting monuments to corruption and the failure of a system that was meant to serve the people. For years, these carcasses of failed projects lingered, useless and untouchable. But then came the rhetoric of Hugo Chavez, who became the 52nd president of Venezuela in 2002. He claimed that property left idle was an insult in a country where millions had no roof over their heads. The state's style was direct and populist. If developers abandoned buildings, then the poor had the right to claim them. Across Caracas, the phenomenon of invasions, organized takeovers of unfinished or vacant buildings was tolerated, even encouraged. With the subpar living conditions of the barrios and the outskirts of the city, it was hardly surprising when desperate people started moving into the abandoned tower. By the end of 2007, the building, which was now known as Tower of David, had become one of the most visible symbols of the Chavez-era trend, occupied by large groups of squatters, known as invasores or invaders in English. Since the movement began in 2003, hundreds of empty buildings across Venezuela, like apartment blocks, office towers, warehouses, even shopping malls, have been seized and converted into makeshift housing. The move into the towers started at night. In October 2007, the first wave of settlers were a group of several hundred displaced due to a flood, led by a group of ex-convicts who saw opportunity in the vast empty structure. A woman from the first group of invasores recalled how they were initially apprehensive about settling into the tower, but felt like they had no choice. "We entered as if into a cave, like pigs, all in there together. We opened the gate, and from that day on, we've been living here. Everyone was looking for a roof to have over their heads because no one had anywhere to live, and it was a solution. They staked out territory on the lower floors, claiming it as their own. Soon after, word spread to desperate families in the barrios. If you were willing to climb the ramps and stairs, there was room, more room than any of them could have ever dreamed of." With the leaders of the initial invasion gatekeeping who were allowed in, selling the right of entry to newcomers that were granted entry, people moved in from the outer regions of Caracas' slums into the convenient downtown location, creating their own makeshift spaces inside the hollow shell of the skyscraper. It wasn't easy. Most sides of the decrepit building were nothing more than a bare concrete skeleton, with gaping window frames and entire walls missing. Families climbed the unfinished ramps and staircases, carrying whatever they could. They moved in with all their worldly items in their arms, carrying mattresses on their backs. To claim a space and make it their own, they built walls room by room, improvising with cinder blocks and scavenged materials, doing numerous rounds up and down dozens of floors of stairs, carrying heavy sacks of cement and bricks. Their renovations and additions were haphazard, with little engineering or planning, leaving interiors filled with daily hazards, exposed rebar jutting from the walls, jagged concrete edges, and stairwells that suddenly ended mid-air. As the community grew, the most accessible levels filled first. The short tower, attached to the main high-rise, was quickly occupied, and families arriving later had no choice but to climb higher. Without elevators or railings on the unfinished stairs, the climb became treacherous. For people moving in with their children and elderly, falls were a constant fear. To ease the burden, a group of young men started a makeshift moto-taxi service, riding motorbikes up the unfinished parking ramps and ferrying residents and groceries as far as the 10th floor, where the ramps ended. Beyond that, it was all on foot. Living in the Tower of David meant no rent, but the cost of living was measured in sweat, as their new lifestyle demanded endless labor. Every family had to haul their own water up the staircases with buckets and lay bricks to build walls between the concrete skeleton. They had to splice their own electricity lines, tapping illegally into the city's power grid. The supply was unstable, blackouts were common and frequent, and every tangled or fraying wire carried the looming risk of fire, threatening the entire building. There was no plumbing, so residents improvised bathrooms using buckets for drainage, often sneakily dumped down, impacting the overall sanitation of the lower floors. Garbage piled up in corners on every floor, waiting to be brought down, attracting pests throughout the building. Heat trapped inside the concrete made apartments stifling during the day, while at night, rain and wind swept through the open walls. Their new dwelling had a constant echo of construction and footsteps on hollow concrete, the hum of pirated electricity overhead, and the smell of waste that never fully left the stairwells. A single misstep could send someone tumbling into the void, but the floors filled up anyway. In the next 6 years, 28 out of the 45 floors of the tower were occupied by an estimated 3,000 people. And yet, despite the unforgiving conditions, families stayed. The residents found a way to cohabitate and create their own laws. But some of the rumors about the tragedies were all too real. One of the best documented incidents involved a little girl who fell to her death. The tower's hallways and apartments were lined with gaping window frames and walls that had never been completed. Families tried to block openings with makeshift solutions using boards or bricks, but it was never enough. It's hard to dig up more information on what really happened here from English news sources, but Spanish-language newspaper El País does answer some questions. The girl's mother, Kimberly Caminiti, was able to move into the tower in 2007 after circumventing El Niño's gatekeeping of who could live in the building. One of her exes was part of the Invasores and had invited her into his 13th floor apartment. At the age of 36 and being a single mother of 3 children, aged 15, 6, and 2, Kimberly couldn't say no to never paying rent again. And while she had to give up some of her peace to live with an ex, however temporary, she was determined to carve out her own space in the building in one of the upper floors. By the time she got there, 23 of the floors were full. It was not safe nor easy to build on the upper floors, which had no walls at all, only a mirrored facade wrapped around some of the outer sides. But by Christmas time in 2009, 2 years after moving into the tower, she was able to complete her spacious apartment on the 25th floor for her family. However, it wasn't long before tragedy struck. Kimberly was a cashier at a supermarket in downtown Caracas. In order to live, she had to work, and her daughter, almost 5 at the time, still wasn't old enough to go to school while she was working, so one of Kimberly's neighbors would watch her along with other children in her care during the day. The kids decided to play hide and seek on that cold February day. The girl thought she had found the perfect hiding space when she ducked behind an appliance cover at the neighbor's place, but it turns out that it was covering a huge pit meant to be the central vertical shaft in the tower construction. The girl slipped through and plummeted hundreds of feet down into the void. It was an accident that happened suddenly, even though the child was under adult supervision, but it's really hard to imagine the immense dread the neighbor went through. When Kimberly received that phone call at work, her world shattered. She couldn't bear to stay at her 25th floor condo that now felt empty after her daughter's death, saying, "4 of us arrived at the tower, and from that day on, we were 3. she ended up returning downstairs to her former partner's house. The story quickly spread among residents and became a grim reminder of how fragile their homemade defenses against the building's flaws really were, and, try as they may, they would never be able to patch every dangerous gap in the building. Another tragedy came from the very system residents had invented to cope with the tower's sheer height. Remember the unfinished parking garage ramp stretching on the first 10 floors, with people setting up a mototaxi service? Obviously, using vehicles was a good solution considering there were no elevators, as some people faced climbing a total of 28 floors on foot without the service, which was especially daunting when considering that they would often be carrying supplies. But the parking garage wasn't exactly walled in either. One night, an inebriated rider lost control of his motorcycle, veering off the ramp and falling to his death, with other residents who knew him left in shock and disbelief. On top of the tragic true stories, endless rumors and the news cycle blamed any criminal activity on them. The skyscraper was also featured in an episode of a popular American TV show, Homeland, in October 2013. In the episode, the character Nicholas Brody is taken to the Tower of David by a group of armed mercenaries led by their leader, conveniently referred to as El Nino as well. The tower was still portrayed as inhabited by squatters, but as the insurgents question Brody, they also give him addictive substances for his gunshot wound injuries. In the meantime, El Nino is portrayed as extremely vicious, killing a man for stealing from him, and later in the episode, killing an imam, a Muslim religious leader, and his wife because they helped Brody escape to the police. Even though the episode was filmed in an abandoned building in San Juan, Puerto Rico, it was still named Tower of David. And you can imagine neither the real El Nino nor the residents of the tower were very happy about how they'd been portrayed in the media. Residents criticized the Homeland episode and the various news articles like John Lee Anderson's that popped up again after the broadcast for sensationalizing their lives. In reality, they had worked hard to make the skyscraper a livable space, building a precarious form of community, however dangerous and improvised it may be. El Nino Daza appointed delegates for each floor to coordinate cleaning and mediate disputes among neighbors, as well as a tower council he headed that would resolve larger issues. The council started renting out the ground-level parking lot to buses for some income, but the residents also paid an affordable monthly fee that went to the maintenance, cleaning, and security of the building. Daza had also tried to clean up the image of the building after the first few years, which attracted some journalists to make an effort to portray how life went inside the concrete hulk. When photographer Alejandro Serrara tried documenting the tower and its residents, having watched the community build and grow over the years from the college he attended across the street, he slowly gained some trust of the families who lived there. So much so that they were having meals together and inviting him inside to have a cold beverage. They once even helped him out when his car broke down and had a massive leak. When he tried asking about the issues with the Malandros, he got a non-answer as well. They said they had kicked out all the criminals. I'd asked how they did that. They'd say, "Don't ask more about that," but they're not here right now. At the time, Router's photographer Jorge Silva, who was able to gain access to respectfully photograph inside the tower, wrote, "The residents of the tower, and particularly those in charge of managing it, were, and still are, very sensitive to media. Publications frequently feature headlines such as Tower of Terror, the Shanty Skyscraper, inside the tallest vertical slum in the world." He wrote about how he appealed to the board of administrators of the tower, explaining that he wanted to document the residents' way of life without judging. "They made me explain my intentions in producing this story so that they could decide whether to grant me access. At the end of the meeting, during which they listened attentively and respectfully, a woman said, 'Ah, so you are not coming to see the crocodile we have tied up in the basement. Out there they say that we have one, which eats people and makes them disappear when they enter the tower.' As soon as she said it, everyone burst out laughing. And when you look at what the squatters were able to manage by 2014, 7 years after the tower was first occupied, you could see the pride they held about what they built. Even though outsiders viewed it as a vertical slum, they admitted to their initial issues with the Malandros, but insisted that by the time the Homeland episode came out, the troublemakers had already been kicked out. They claimed the issues in surrounding neighborhoods like holdups targeting ATMs, the trade of illicit drugs, and persistent street crime no longer had anything to do with the tower and its residents. In reality, the demographics of the tower residents were mostly low-income, working-class families who just happened to live in the skyscraper. By 2013, they no longer had to haul water up the incomplete staircases every day. A piping system with a water pump connected to a generator had been built with Daza's efforts, with reservoir tanks on each floor. It was precarious, but functional. at least for the bottom half of the building. The upper floors who had issues accessing plumbing could at least fetch water from the lower floors instead of going all the way down to ground level. The tower also received unofficial support from the government later on. The makeshift electrical system they had was brought up to standard, and they didn't have to steal from the grid any longer, with each family paying for their share. The residents had already set up spaces like a rooftop gym on the helipad and a lower courtyard complete with a basketball hoop. But the government also added some additional resources, such as a children's library that even had computers and a kids' sports program with soccer and basketball. Considering how hard it was to clamber down all the stairs to go into the city to do their groceries, then go all the way back up treacherous staircases with heavy bags, businesses began to flourish inside. A couple of bodegas opened up, at first only one on the 9th floor, selling daily essentials like vegetables, soap, and small luxuries like soda. The woman who owned it, Zeta Gomez, was in her 60s, living in the tower with her daughter, grandson, and elderly mother. She was grateful to be there, considering it so safe that she was able to prop her shop's door open during the day. Another opportunistic woman, Miriam Figueroa, saw the need for another shop on the upper portion of the tower, opening one on the 22nd floor and hiring other people to carry her stock upstairs. An unlicensed dental clinic accepted patients. Someone opened an internet cafe. Another started a tattoo parlor. There were beauty salons and independent hairdressers and seamstresses working from their own homes. Even a few makeshift daycare services were started so that parents could go to work outside in Caracas without worrying about their children. And these workers were pretty much just normal people with normal jobs, just living from paycheck to paycheck in one of the strangest dwellings in the world. Among their occupations, there were nurses, bus drivers, shopkeepers, security guards, even government employees. One of the retired public servants continued working as a taxi driver in the city during the daytime. Children of the tower attended their schools as normal, with students running out of the building in the morning to catch their buses. A 27-year-old policeman lived in the tower with his wife and their 3 kids. With the police force salary not being high in the country, it felt like it was the only choice for the family's independence, since they had been staying with his mother-in-law before. He worked as a taxi driver on the side and other odd jobs to make ends meet, and didn't feel like he had ownership in the building. Nevertheless, that was what he was able to afford. Eventually, the residents of the skyscraper had settled down into the humdrum routine of life, busy getting up to go to work each day, clambering down the steps 20-plus floors, and dreading the climb back up after spending all day in the loud city. But like all communities, the Tower of David could not last forever. In the meantime, the government had changed hands. If Hugo Chavez's style was about tolerance, seeing invasions of abandoned buildings as a kind of social justice, Nicolas Maduro's style was about control. By the time he took office in 2013, the occupations that once symbolized empowerment came to be seen as a liability, and for a government trying to project order in the midst of economic chaos, the sight of a vertical slum in the heart of Caracas was viewed as an embarrassment. According to the government, as tragedies mounted, including other instances of children falling to their deaths through the tower's open shafts and unfinished walls, they faced mounting pressure to act. Officials had tolerated the occupation for years, turning a blind eye to Daza's territory. But with whispers of gang justice still rampant throughout the city, they decided that safety was an important concern after all. They had to be careful about how they approached the eviction, though. Allowing squatters to stay was a sign of showing weakness, but forcefully removing them could be framed as authoritarian. And while the government had a more authoritarian style indeed, they wanted to avoid riots, and Melandros were just too influential to the communities around them. It happened in phases. At first, Daza was incarcerated again in November 2013 for unexplained reasons. He complained that the government was trying to undermine his leadership in the tower, but he was stuck in prison awaiting an undetermined future trial date, and the residents were left without his protection. With Daza out of the picture, in 2014, President Nicolas Maduro's government launched Operation Zamora, designed to gradually empty the tower. Negotiations with the tower's resident board were conducted for 3 months. The government promised a lot. Families were offered new apartments in Ciudad Zamora, a state-built housing development in Cuá, about 25 miles south of Caracas, more than an hour's drive away. They emphasized that this was a relocation rather than an eviction, to push residents into agreeing to empty the Tower of David. By July 2014, the government finally got their way, and residents began preparations to leave voluntarily. Buses carried groups of families out each week. It was a carefully staged exercise in optics, with residents bussed out floor by floor, television cameras rolling, and the government promising a fresh start. By mid-2015, the operation was complete. More than 1,000 families, amounting to around 3,000 residents, had left the tower behind. The eviction was framed by the state as a humanitarian success, part of Chavez's Gran Misión Vivienda Venezuela housing mission. For many families, however, it was bittersweet. Ciudad Zamora offered new apartments with plumbing, electricity, and relative safety, but it was far from Caracas' economic center. Residents who had once walked to jobs in the capital now faced long commutes or unemployment. Why had the Tower of David worked in the first place? Because people made it work. The resourcefulness in getting essentials like water and electricity and focusing on building the community up along with their own little spaces made the tower livable. If they had gone into it alone, it wouldn't have lasted as long as it did. The squatters began with a raw desire for a roof over their heads, turning the hollow concrete frame into a functional vertical village. It was improvised, fragile, and downright dangerous, but undeniably alive. And with the great location downtown and a dignity compared to muddy hillside shanty towns, they were able to have a good life. And yet, even as they conquered and thrived against all odds, they weren't able to keep it. With the government arguing that the building was unsafe, showing the children who had fallen for their deaths as proof, well, you can't really argue with facts. Yesenia Polanco, living with her 3 boys in the building, expressed feeling defeated by the uprooting. She said, "They didn't force us out, so that's good, but they could have also given us houses closer to where we are now and to where our children go to school." Alfonso Garcia, who had been living in the tower with his wife and 2 daughters for the past 5 years, said, "We were aware we had no rights over our homes here, so we knew this day would come. Like all changes, it is a bit scary, but we are all happy to be finally given a house." It was an ordeal to move more than 3,000 inhabitants from 28 floors of the skyscraper. It couldn't be done all at once, so the floors were emptied out 3 floors at a time. As the residents packed up all their life's possessions, police wearing riot gear accompanied by groups of soldiers wielding Kalashnikovs were on the standby to escort them out in buses that would transport them to their new homes. The residents didn't seem to regret their life in the derelict building. Giulia Mapara, a new mother at the time of the relocation, said, "Necessity brought me here, and the tower gave me a good home. I was here for 7 years. I'm going to miss it, but it's time to move on." Another resident, a caterer who had been living on the 9th floor for the last 5 years, reminisced. The view was so beautiful as he led his wife and 3 children away to their new life. More than a decade after its residents were relocated, the Tower of David now stands derelict and empty to this day in the heart of Caracas, haunting the city with its apocalyptic image. There are still no clear plans of what will happen to the building, but after 3,000 people proved what was possible with hard work, determination, and a strong sense of community, it is no longer useless, only legally unusable. If you enjoyed this video and would like to show your appreciation to the people whose hard work made it possible, then consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. It's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos, like this one about how the supposedly genius Louvre thieves actually made a big mistake that just recently got them arrested. Click the video on your screen now to hear the full story.